Chapter 4. When the banks were completed and the battering rams brought, and could do nothing, Titus gave orders to set fire to the gates of the temple, in no long time after which the holy house itself was burnt down, even against his consent. And now 2 of the legions had completed their banks on the 8th day of the month Louis, whereupon Titus gave orders that the battering rams should be brought, and set over the western edifice of the inner temple. For before these were brought, the firmest of all other engines had battered the wall for 6 days together without ceasing, without making any impression upon it. But the vast largeness and strong connection of the stones were superior to that engine, and to the other battering rams also. Other Romans did indeed undermine the foundations of the northern gate, and after a world of pains removed the outermost stones. Yet was the gate still upheld by the inner stones, and stood still unhurt, till the workmen, despairing of all such attempts by engines and crows, brought their ladders to the cloisters. Now the Jews did not interrupt them in so doing, but when they were gotten up, they fell upon them and fought with them. Some of them they thrust down and threw them backwards headlong. Others of them they met and slew. They also beat many of those that went down the ladders again, and slew them with their swords before they could bring their shields to protect them. Nay, some of the ladders they threw down from above when they were full of armed men. A great slaughter was made of the Jews also at the same time, while those that bear the ensigns fought hard for them, as deeming it a terrible thing, and what would tend to their great shame, if they permitted them to be stolen away. Yet did the Jews at length get possession of these engines, and destroyed those that had gone up the ladders, while the rest were so intimidated by what those suffered who were slain, that they retired, although none of the Romans died without having done good service before his death. Of the seditious, those that had fought bravely in the former battles did as like now, as besides them did Eleazar, the brother's son of Simon the tyrant. But when Titus perceived that his endeavors to spare the foreign temple turned to the damage of his soldiers and then be killed, he gave order to set the gates on fire. In the meantime there deserted to him Ananus, who came from Emmaus, the most bloody of all Simon's guards, and Archelaus the son of Magadatus, they hoping to be still forgiven, because they left the Jews at a time when they were the conquerors. Titus objected to these men, as a cunning trick of theirs, as he had been informed of their other barbarities toward the Jews. He was going in all haste to have them both slain. He told them that they were only driven to this desertion because of the utmost distress they were in, and did not come away of their own good disposition, and that those did not deserve to be preserved, by whom their own city was already set on fire, out of which fire they now hurried themselves away. However, the security he had promised deserters overcame his resentments, and he dismissed them accordingly, though he did not give them the same privileges that he had afforded to others. And now the soldiers had already put fire to the gates, and the silver that was over them quickly carried the flames to the wood that was within it, whence it spread itself on all the sudden, and caught hold on the cloisters. Upon the Jews seeing this fire all about them, their spirits sunk together with their bodies, and they were under such astonishment that not one of them made any haste either to defend himself or to quench the fire, but they stood as mute spectators of it only. However, they did not so grieve at the loss of what was now burning, as to grow wiser thereby for the time to come, but as though the holy house itself had been on fire already, they whetted their passions against the Romans. This fire prevailed during that day and the next also, for the soldiers were not able to burn all the cloisters that were round about together at one time, but only by pieces. But then on the next day Titus commanded part of his army to quench the fire, and to make a road for the more easy marching up of the legions, while he himself gathered the commanders together. Of those that were assembled, the 6 principal persons: Tiberius Alexander, the commander under the general of the whole army, with Sextus Cerealis, the commander of the 5th legion, and Larsius Lepidus, the commander of the 10th legion, and Titus Phrygius, the commander of the 15th legion. And there was also with them Eternius, the leader of the 2 legions that came from Alexandria, and Marcus Antonius Julianus, procurator of Judea. After these came together all the rest of the procurators and tribunes. Titus proposed to these that they should give him their advice what should be done about the holy house. Now some of these thought it would be the best way to act according to the rules of war, and demolish it, because the Jews would never leave off rebelling while that house was standing, at which house it was that they used to get all together. Others of them were of the opinion that in case the Jews would leave it, none of them would lay their arms up in it, he might save it, but that in case they got upon it and fought any more, he might burn it. because it then must be looked upon not only as a holy house, but as a citadel, and that impiety of burning it would then belong to those that forced this to be done, not to them. But Titus said, quote, that although the Jews should get upon that holy house and fight us thence, yet ought we not to revenge ourselves on things that are inanimate, instead of the men themselves, unquote, and that he was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that was, because this would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their government while it continued. So Fronto and Alexander and Cerealis grew bold upon that declaration, and agreed to the opinion of Titus. Then was this assembly dissolved, and when Titus had given orders to the commanders that the rest of their forces should lie still, but that they should make use of such as were most courageous in this attack. So he commanded that the chosen men that were taken out of the cohorts should make their way through the ruins and quench the fire. Now it is true on this day the Jews were so weary and under such consternation that they refrained from any attacks. But on the next day they gathered their whole force together, and ran upon those that guarded the outward court of the temple very boldly, through the east gate, and this about the 2nd hour of the day. These guards received their attack with great bravery, and by covering themselves with their shields before as if it were with a wall, they drew their squadron close together. Yet it was evident that they could not abide there very long, but would be overborne by the multitude of those that sallied out upon them, and by the heat of their passion. However, Caesar, seeing from the tower of Antonia that this squadron was likely to give way, he sent some chosen horsemen to support them. Hereupon the Jews found themselves not able to sustain their onset, and upon the slaughter of those in the forefront, many of the rest were put to flight. But as the Romans were going off, the Jews turned it upon them, and fought them. And as those Romans came back upon them, they retreated again, until about the 5th hour of the day they were overborne, and shut themselves up in the inner court of the temple. So Titus retired into the tower of Antonia, and resolved to storm the temple the next day, early in the morning, with his whole army, and to encamp round about the holy house. But as for that house, God had, for certain, long ago doomed it to the fire, and now that fatal day was come, according to the revolution of ages. It was the 10th day of the month Louis, upon which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon. Although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves, and were occasioned by them, for upon Titus's retiring, the seditious lay still for a little while, and then attacked the Romans again, when those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning the inner court of the temple. But these Romans put the Jews to flight, and proceeded as far as the holy house itself. At which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders, and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched someone out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was that they kept such a guard about it. Now a certain person came running to Titus, and told him of this fire, and as he was resting himself in his tent after the last battle, whereupon he rose up in great haste, and ran to the holy house, in order to have a stop put to the fire. After him followed all his commanders, and after them followed the several legions, in great astonishment. So there was a great clamor and tumult raised, as was natural upon the disorderly motion of so great an army. Then did Caesar, both by calling to the soldiers that were fighting with a loud voice, and by giving a signal to them with his right hand, order them to quench the fire. But they did not hear what he said, though he spake so loud, having their ears already dimmed by a greater noise another way. Nor did they attend to the signal he made with his hand either, as still some of them were distracted with fighting, and others with passion. But as for the legions that came running thither, neither any persuasions nor any threatenings could restrain their violence, but each one's own passion was his commander at this time. And as they were crowding into the temple together, many of them were trampled upon by one another, while a great number fell among the ruins of the cloisters, which were still hot and smoking, and were destroyed in the same miserable way with those whom they had conquered. And when they were come near to the holy house, they made as if they did not so much as hear Caesar's orders to the contrary, but they encouraged those that were before them to set it on fire. As for the seditious, they were in too great distress already to afford their assistance towards quenching the fire. They were everywhere slain, and everywhere beaten. And as for a great part of the people, they were weak and without arms, and had their throats cut wherever they were caught. Now round about the altar lay dead bodies heaped upon one another, as at the steps going up to it ran a great quantity of their blood, whither also the dead bodies that were slain above on the altar fell down. And now, since Caesar was no way able to restrain the enthusiastic fury of the soldiers, and the fire proceeded on more and more, he went into the holy place of the temple with his commanders and saw it, and with what was in it, which he found to be far superior to what the relations of foreigners contained, and not inferior to what we ourselves boasted of and believed about it. But as the flame had not yet reached to its inward parts, but was still consuming the rooms that were about the holy house, and Titus supposing what the fact was, that the house itself might yet be saved, he came in haste and endeavored to persuade the soldiers to quench the fire, and he gave order to Liberalius the centurion, and one of those spearmen that were about him, to beat the soldiers that were refractory with their staves, and to restrain them. Yet were their passions too hard for the regards they had for Caesar, and the dread they had of him who forbade him, as was their hatred of the Jews, and a certain vehement inclination to fight them, too hard for them also. Moreover, the hope of plunder induced many to go on, as having this opinion, that all the places within were full of money, and seeing that all around about it was made of gold. And besides, one of those that went into the place prevented Caesar, when he ran so hastily out to restrain the soldiers, and threw the fire upon the hinges of the gate, in the dark, whereby the flame burst out from within the holy house itself immediately, when the commanders retired, and Caesar with them, and when nobody any longer forbade those that were without to set fire to it. And thus was the holy house burnt down, without Caesar's approbation. Now, although anyone would justly lament the destruction of such a work as this, since it was the most admirable of all the works that we have seen or heard of, both for its curious structure and its magnitude, and also for the vast wealth bestowed upon it, as well as for the glorious reputation it had for its holiness, yet might such a one comfort himself with this thought, that it was fate that decreed it so to be, which is inevitable, both as to living creatures and as to works and places also. However, one cannot but wonder at the accuracy of this period thereto relating, for the same month and day we now observed, as I said before, wherein the holy house was burnt formerly by the Babylonians. Now the number of years that passed from its first foundation, which was laid by King Solomon, till this its destruction, which happened in the 2nd year of the reign of Vespasian, are collected to be 1,130, besides 7 months and 15 days. And from the second building of it, which was done by Haggai, in the 2nd year of Cyrus the king, till its destruction under Vespasian, there were 639 years and 45 days. Chapter 5. The great distress of the Jews were in upon the conflagration of the holy house, concerning a false prophet, and the signs that preceded this destruction. While the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Nor was there a commiseration of any age, or any reverence of gravity, but children and old men and profane persons, and priests were all slain in the same manner, so that this war went round all sorts of men, and brought them to destruction, as well as those that made supplication for their lives, as those that defended themselves by fighting. The flame was also carried a long way, and made an echo, together with the groans of those that were slain. Because this hill was high, and the works of the temple were very great, one would have thought the whole city had been on fire. Nor can one imagine anything either greater or more terrible than this noise, for there was at once a shout of the Roman legions, who were marching all together, and a sad clamor of the seditious, who were now surrounded with fire and sword. The people also that were left above were beaten back upon the enemy, and under a great consternation, and made sad moans at the calamity they were under. The multitude also that was in the city joined in this outcry with those that were upon the hill. And besides, many of those that were worn away by the famine, and their mouths almost closed, when they saw the fire of the holy house, they exerted their utmost strength, and brake out into groans and outcries again. Pera did also return the echo, as well as the mountains round about the city, and augmented the force of the entire noise. Yet was the misery itself more terrible than this disorder, for one would have thought that the hill itself on which the temple stood was seething hot, as full of fire on every part of it, that the blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those that were slain more in number than those that slew them, for the ground did nowhere appear visible, for the dead bodies that lay on it, But the soldiers went over heaps of those bodies as they ran upon such as fled from them. And now it was that the multitude of the robbers were thrust out of the inner court of the temple by the Romans, and had much ado to get into the outward court, and from thence into the city, while the remainder of the populace fled into the cloister of that outer court. As for the priests, some of them plucked up from the holy house the spikes that were upon it, with their bases which were made of lead, and shot them at the Romans instead of darts. But then, as they gained nothing by so doing, and as the fire burst out upon them, they retired to the wall that was 8 cubits broad, and there they tarried. Yet did 2 of these of eminence among them, who might have saved themselves by going over to the Romans, or have borne up with courage, and taken their fortune with the others, throw themselves into the fire, and were burnt together with the holy house. Their names were Maerus the son of Belgus, and Joseph the son of Delius. And now the Romans, judging that it was in vain to spare what was round about the holy house, burnt all those places, as also the remains of the cloisters and the gates, 2 excepted, the one on the east side and the other on the south, both which, however, they burnt afterward. They also burnt down the treasury chambers, in which was an immense quantity of money, and an immense number of garments, and other precious goods that were reposited. And to speak all in a few words, there it was that the entire riches of the Jews were heaped up together, while the rich people had there built themselves chambers to contain such furniture. The soldiers also came to the rest of the cloisters that were in the outer court of the temple, whither the women and children, and a great mixed multitude of the people fled, in number about 6,000. But before Caesar had determined anything about these people, or given the commanders any orders relating to them, the soldiers were in such a rage that they set that cloister on fire, by which means it came to pass that some of those were destroyed by throwing themselves down headlong, and some were burnt in the cloisters themselves. Nor did any of them escape with his life. A false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day, that God commanded them to get upon the temple, and there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. Now there was then a great number of false prophets suborned by the tyrants to impose on the people, who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting, and that they might be buoyed up above fear and care by such hopes. Now a man that is in adversity does easily comply with such promises, for when such a seducer makes him believe that he shall be delivered from those miseries which oppress him, then it is that the patient is full of hopes of such his deliverance. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, and did so plainly foretell their future desolation, but like men infatuated, without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month of Xanthicus or Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house, that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also, a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone, was seen to be open of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon, running to the captain of the temple, and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open them to the gate of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved by its own accord, and that the gate was open for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month of Artemisius or Jar, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For, before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Moreover, at that feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, in the first place, they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude, saying, Let us remove hence. But what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, the son of Ananus, a plebeian and a husbandman, who 4 years before the war began, and at a time when the city was in a very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast whereupon it is our custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God in the temple, began on of a sudden to cry aloud, quote, A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, and a voice against this whole people, unquote. This was his cry as he went about by day and by night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. Yet he did not either say anything for himself, nor anything peculiar to those that chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he had cried before. Hereupon our rulers, supposing, as the case proved to be, that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. Yet he did not make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, at every stroke of the whip his answer was, Woe, woe to Jerusalem. And when Albinus, for he was then our procurator, asked him who he was, and whence he came, and why he uttered such words, he made no manner of reply to what he said, but still did not leave off his melancholy ditty, till Albinus took him to be a madman, and dismissed him. Now during all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them while he said so, but he every day uttered those lamentable words, as if it were his premeditated vow, Woe, woe to Jerusalem. Nor did he give ill words to any of those that beat him every day, nor good words to those that gave him food. But this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. This cry of his was the loudest at the festivals, and he continued to this ditty for 7 years and 5 months, without growing hoarse or being tired therewith, until the very time he saw his presage in earnest fulfilled in our siege, when it ceased. For as he was going round upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost force, Woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house. And just as he added the last, Woe, woe to myself also, there came a stone out of one of the engines, and smote him, and killed him instantly. And as he was uttering the very same presages, he gave up the ghost. Now if anyone consider these things, he will find that God takes care of mankind, and by all ways possible foreshows to our race what is for their preservation, but that men perish by those miseries which they madly and voluntarily bring upon themselves. For the Jews, by demolishing the tower of Antonia, had made their temple 4 square, while at the same time they had it written in their sacred oracles, that then should their city be taken, as well as their holy house, when once their temple should become 4 square. But now what did the most elevate them in undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, how, quote, about that time one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth, unquote. The Jews took this prediction to belong to themselves in particular, and many of the wise men were thereby deceived in their determination. Now this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea. However, it is not possible for men to avoid fate, although they see it beforehand. But these men interpreted some of these signals according to their own pleasure, and some of them they utterly despised, until their madness was demonstrated, both by the taking of their city and of their own destruction. Chapter 6. How the Romans carried their ensigns to the temple, and made joyful acclamations to Titus. The speech that Titus made to the Jews when they made their supplication for mercy, what reply they made thereto, and how that reply moved Titus's indignation against them. And now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and of all the buildings round about it, brought their ensigns to the temple, and set them over against its eastern gate, and there did they offer sacrifices to them, and there did they make Titus imperator, with the greatest acclamations of joy. And now all the soldiers had such vast quantities of the spoils which they had gotten by plunder, that in Syria a pound weight of gold was sold for half its former value. But as for those priests that kept themselves still upon the wall of the holy house, there was a boy that, out of the thirst he was in, desired some of the Roman guards to give him their right hands as a security for his life, and confessed he was very thirsty. These guards commiserated his age and the distress he was in, and gave him their right hands accordingly. So he came down himself and drank some water, and filled the vessel he had with him when he came to them with water, and then went off, and fled away to his own friends. Nor could any of those guards overtake him, but still they reproached him for his perfidiousness. To which he made this answer, quote, I have not broken the agreement, for the security I had given me was not in order to my staying with you, but only in order to my coming down safely, and taking up some water, both which things I have performed, and thereupon think myself to have been faithful to my engagement. Unquote. Hereupon those whom the child had imposed upon admired at his cunning, and that on account of his age. On the 5th day afterward, the priests that were pined with former famine came down, and they were brought to Titus by the guards. They begged for their lives. But he replied that the time of pardon was over as to them, and that this very holy house, on whose account only they could justly hope to be preserved, was destroyed, and that it was agreeable to their office that the priests should perish with the house itself to which they belonged. So he ordered them to be put to death. But as for the tyrants themselves, and those that were with them, when they found they were encompassed on every side, and as it were walled around, without any method of escaping, they desired to treat with Titus by word of mouth. Accordingly, such was the kindness of his nature, and his desire of preserving the city from destruction, joined to the advice of his friends, who now thought the robbers were come to a temper, that he placed himself on the western side of the outer court of the temple, for there were gates on that side above the Xystus, and a bridge that connected the upper city to the temple. This bridge it was that lay between the tyrants and Caesar, and parted them, while the multitude stood on each side, those of the Jewish nation about Sinran and John, with great hopes of pardon, and the Romans about Caesar in great expectation how Titus would receive their supplication. So Titus charged his soldiers to restrain their rage, and to let their darts alone, and appointed an interpreter between them, which was a sign that he was the conqueror, and first began the discourse, and said, I hope you, sirs, are now satiated with the miseries of your country, who have not bad any just notions, whether our great power or of your great weakness, have, like madmen, after a violent and inconsiderate manner, made such attempts as have brought your people, your city, and your holy house to destruction. You have been the men that have never left off rebelling since Pompey first conquered you, and have, since that time, made open war with the Romans. Have you depended on your multitude, while a very small part of the Roman soldiery have been strong enough for you? Have you relied on the fidelity of your confederates? And what nations are there out of the limits of our dominion that would choose to assist the Jews before the Romans? Are your bodies stronger than ours? Nay, you know that the strong Germans themselves are our servants. Have you stronger walls than we have? Pray, what greater obstacle is there than the wall of the ocean, with which the Britons are encompassed, and yet you do adore the arms of the Romans? Do you exceed us in courage of soul, and in the sagacity of your commanders? Nay, indeed, you cannot but know that the very Carthaginians have been conquered by us. It can therefore be nothing certainly but the kindness of us Romans which has excited you against us, who in the first place have given you this land to possess, and in the next place have set over you the kings of your own nation, and in the third place have preserved the laws of your forefathers to you, and have withal permitted you to live, either by yourselves or among others, as it should please you. And what is our chief favor of all, we have given you leave to gather up that tribute which is paid to God, with such other gifts that are dedicated to him. Nor have we called those that carried those donations to account, nor prohibited them, till at length you became richer than we ourselves, even when you were our enemies, and you made preparations for war against us with our own money. Nay, after all, when you were in the enjoyment of all these advantages, You turned your too great plenty against those that gave it to you, and like merciless serpents have thrown out your poison against those that treated you kindly. I suppose, therefore, that you might despise the slothfulness of Nero, and like limbs of the body that are broken or dislocated, you then did lie quiet, waiting for some other time, though still with a malicious intention, and have now showed your distemper to be greater than ever, and have extended your desires as far as your impotent and immense hopes would enable you to do it. At this time my father came into this country, not with a design to punish you for what you had done under Cestius, but to admonish you, for he had come to overthrow your nation. He had run directly to your fountainhead, and had immediately laid this city waste, whereas he went and burnt Galilee and the neighboring parts, and thereby gave you time for repentance, which instance of humanity you took for an argument of his weakness, and nourished up your impudence by our mildness. When Nero was gone out of the world, you did as the wickedest wretches would have done, and encouraged yourselves to act against us by our civil dissensions, and abused that time, when both I and my father were gone away to Egypt, to make preparations for this war. Nor were you ashamed to raise disturbances against us when we were made emperors, and while you had experienced how mild we had been, when we were no more than generals of the army. But when the government was devolved upon us, and when all other people did thereupon lie quiet, and even foreign nations sent embassies and congratulated our access to the government, then did you Jews show yourselves to be our enemies. You sent embassies to those of your nation that are beyond the Euphrates, to assist you in raising disturbances. New walls were built by you round your city. Seditions arose, and one tyrant contended against another, and a civil war broke out among you. Such indeed has become none but so wicked a people as you are. I then came to the city, as unwillingly sent by my father, and received melancholy injunctions from him. When I heard that the people were disposed to peace, I rejoiced at it. I exhorted you to leave off these proceedings before I began this war. I spared you even when you had fought against me a great while. I gave my right hand as security to the deserters. I observed what I had promised faithfully. When they fled to me, I had compassion on many of those that I had taken captive. I tortured those that were eager for war, in order to restrain them. It was unwillingly that I brought my engines of war against your walls. I always prohibited my soldiers, when they were set upon your slaughter, from their severity against you. After every victory I persuaded you to peace, as though I had been myself conquered. When I came near your temple, I again departed from the laws of war, and exhorted you to spare your own sanctuary, and to preserve your holy house to yourselves. I allowed you a quiet exit out of it, and security for your preservation. Nay, if you had a mind, I gave you leave to fight in another place. Yet have you still despised every one of my proposals, and have set fire to your holy house with your own hands. And now, vile wretches, do you desire to treat me by word of mouth? To what purpose is it that you could save such a holy house as was this, which is now destroyed? What preservation can you now desire after the destruction of your temple? Yet do you stand still at this very time in your armor? Nor can you bring yourselves so much as to pretend to be supplicants, even in this your utmost extremity. O miserable creatures, what is it you depend on? Are not your people dead? Is not your holy house gone? Is not your city in my power? Are not your own very lives in my hands? And do you still deem it a part of valor to die? However, I will not imitate your madness. If you throw down your arms and deliver up your bodies to me, I grant you your lives. And I will act like a mild master of a family. What cannot be healed shall be punished, and the rest I will preserve for my own use. To that offer of Titus they made this reply, quote, that they should not accept it, because they had sworn never to do so, but they desired that they might leave to go through the wall that had been made about them, with their wives and children, but that they would go into the desert and leave the city to him. And at this Titus had great indignation, that when they were in the case of men already taken captives, that they should pretend to make their own terms with him, as if they had been conquerors. So he ordered this proclamation to be made to them, that they should no more come out to him as deserters, no hope for any further security, for that he would thenceforth spare nobody, but fight them with his whole army, and that they must save themselves as well as they could, for that he would from thenceforth treat them according to the laws of war. So he gave orders to the soldiers both to burn and to plunder the city, who did nothing indeed that day, but on the next day they set fire to the repository of the archives, to Acra, to the council house, and to the place called Ophlus, at which time the fire proceeded as far as the palace of Queen Helena, which was in the middle of Acre. The lanes were also burnt down, as were also those houses that were full of the dead bodies as such as were destroyed by the famine. On the same day it was that the sons and brethren of Izates the king, together with many others of eminent men of the populace, got together there, and besought Caesar to give them his right hand for their security, upon which, though he was very angry at all that were now remaining, yet he did not lay aside his old moderation, but received those men. At that time indeed he kept them all in custody, but still bound the king's sons and kinsmen, and led them with him to Rome, in order to make them hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans.